I didn't say a word, not one. And the look on my son's face when he realized what that silence meant, that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. People thought I was weak. My brother called me that night and said, "You just let her walk all over you." My neighbor, who somehow heard about it through the church grapevine, left a voicemail telling me I should have done something, said something, made a scene. Even my sister, who I love dearly and who usually knows better, sent me a long text about how I was setting a bad example for my grandchildren by not standing up for myself. Nobody asked me what I was actually planning. My name is Lawrence. I'm 53 years old, and I've worked in construction project management in the Edmonton area for going on 26 years. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't raise my voice. I never have. My father was the same way, a quiet man who said exactly what he meant and not one syllable more. People used to mistake that for weakness. They always regretted it. My son Elliot is 31. He's smart, good-looking, the kind of person who lights up a room when he walks in. He got that from his mother, Judith. I got him into hockey when he was 4 years old, drove him to 6 a.m. practices for 11 winters, sat in cold arenas with a thermos of bad coffee, and watched him work harder than most kids twice his age. I am proud of him in the way that lives quietly in your chest, the kind of pride you don't always know how to say out loud. He met Sienna when they were both working downtown, at one of those open-concept offices where everyone uses the same kitchen and schedules conflict over the same meeting rooms. She was in marketing. He was doing project coordination for a tech firm. They dated for 2 years before he brought her home. I want to be clear about something. I tried with Sienna. I genuinely tried. Judith liked her immediately. Judith likes most people. It's one of the things I love about her, and I made a real effort to follow her lead. The first Christmas Sienna joined us, I bought her a gift card to a bookstore she'd mentioned once, in passing, during a conversation at Thanksgiving. She looked at it and said, "Oh, that's so sweet." But the way she said it made it feel like I'd handed her something she was going to leave in the car. Judith squeezed my hand later and said, "I'd done well." I let it go. The second Christmas, Sienna had us over to their apartment in St. Albert. She'd cooked, which I respected, but she spent most of dinner talking to her own family on FaceTime, holding her phone up at the table, and narrating things to her mother back in Victoria. At one point, she turned the phone toward me mid-bite and said, "Mom, this is Lawrence," and her mother gave me this tight smile that I can only describe as tolerant, like she was being asked to acknowledge the existence of a parking meter. I said it was nice to meet her, because I'm not going to be rude to someone's mother on Christmas Day, but I noticed, you always notice these things. You just choose how much weight to give them. Elliot proposed to Sienna in the spring, on a trip they took to Banff. He called me the morning after, before they'd posted anything online, and I could hear in his voice that he was genuinely happy. That's the part I keep coming back to. He was happy. I told him I was glad for him, and I meant it. The engagement was 8 months long. In that time, Judith and I were invited to one planning dinner. 1. Sienna's family flew in from Victoria twice, and each time there were family dinners we weren't included in, events we found out about afterward through things Elliot let slip. I didn't make a production of it. When Judith mentioned it to Elliot once, gently, not accusatory, he said Sienna just wanted to keep things manageable. I nodded when she told me. I let it go. But here's the thing about letting things go repeatedly. They don't actually go anywhere. They accumulate. They stack up quietly, like those boxes in the back of a garage that you keep meaning to sort through, until one day you open the door and the whole pile comes down on you. The wedding was in September, at a venue just outside Leduc, a converted barn, the kind that costs $8,000 to rent for a Saturday. It was genuinely beautiful. I'll give Sienna that. She has taste, and the place looked like something out of a magazine, with Edison lights strung across the rafters, and long wooden tables and flowers I later found out were imported from somewhere in the Netherlands. Judith wore a deep burgundy dress she'd bought in May, and lost 7 pounds to feel comfortable in. I remember her standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, the morning of the wedding, adjusting the neckline, and I told her she looked beautiful. She really did. She was nervous. Not in a bad way, but in the way you get nervous when something matters to you. Elliot was her son getting married. She wanted everything to be right. We arrived early, the way we always do for things that matter. We found our seats. We'd been assigned to a round table, near the middle of the room, not near the head table, which I noticed but didn't comment on. At the ceremony, Sienna's family had the entire front 2 rows on their side. Our side had Judith and me, my brother and his wife, and Judith's sister. 6 people. Sienna's side had 40, easy. I watched my son walk down the aisle and thought about those 6 a.m. hockey practices. The ceremony itself was fine. The vows were personal. Elliot actually wrote his, and they were good, thoughtful. He cried a little, which I wasn't expecting. Judith held my hand through the whole thing. The reception is where it went wrong. The speeches happened before dinner. The best man spoke. Elliot's friend from university, a guy named Paul who'd known him for 10 years and made a joke about a camping trip that I didn't fully understand, but everyone laughed at. Sienna's maid of honor spoke, and she was polished, clearly had practiced. Then the MC invited anyone who wanted to add a few words. I had planned to say something, nothing long. I'd written a few sentences on a note card, something about watching Elliot grow up, something about being proud of the man he'd become, something about welcoming Sienna to the family. Simple. Honest. I stood up. I introduced myself as Elliot's father, and before I could get past the second sentence, Sienna leaned over to Elliot and said something. I watched him look at the MC. The MC said, "We'll keep it brief for time," and that was that. I finished my 3 sentences standing in front of a room of 160 people, feeling like I'd been subtly informed that my presence at the microphone was an inconvenience. I sat back down. I kept my face still. Elliot's toast to his parents, which the MC introduced as the groom's words of thanks to the families, lasted about 90 seconds. He thanked Sienna's parents by name, both of them, said a few specific things about her mother's warmth and her father's guidance. Then he turned to our table and said, "And thanks to my parents, of course." That was it, of course. Judith's hand found mine under the table. I squeezed it once. I want to pause here and tell you something about my wife. Judith worked as a registered nurse for 24 years. She has held the hands of people who were dying. She has delivered news that no one wants to hear. She is one of the most quietly dignified people I have ever met in my life, and I have never once seen her cause a scene or make someone else's moment about herself. What happened next was not something she deserved, not even close. It was about 40 minutes into dinner. Judith had gotten up to use the restroom. On her way back to our table, she stopped to hug Elliot, just briefly, the way mothers do. She put her hand on his cheek for a second and told him she loved him. That was it. That was the whole thing. Sienna stood up from her chair. She crossed the distance between them in about 3 steps, and then she put her hand on Judith's arm, not gently, and said, in a voice loud enough that the 2 tables nearest us went quiet, "This is my day, not yours. You've been hovering all evening, and nobody here needs you to make it about yourself. You should just go." Judith's face didn't crumble. That's what I remember. It went still, the way a lake goes still right before a storm. Everything just stopped moving. She stepped back once. Her chin came up slightly. I was on my feet before Sienna finished her last sentence. I did not raise my voice. I did not grab anyone. I did not make it a scene with yelling or pointed fingers, or anything that would give someone a story to tell afterward about the father-in-law who lost his temper at a wedding. I walked over to where Judith was standing. I took her hand, and I looked at my son. Elliot was sitting in his chair. He looked at me. He looked at Sienna. He looked at Judith. He didn't stand up. He didn't say a word. I held Judith's hand. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he'd remember it, long enough that he'd know exactly what I saw. And then I said, quietly, "Enjoy your evening," and I walked my wife out of that barn. We drove home mostly in silence. Judith cried for a while in the passenger seat, not dramatically, just the quiet kind of crying that's worse somehow, the kind that means something has broken that wasn't supposed to break. I kept my hand on her knee. "Somewhere past Beaumont," she said. "I just wanted to hug him." "I know," I told her. "I know." When we got home, I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table until about 1 in the morning, not saying much, just sitting. At some point I got up and went to my office, and I did something I hadn't planned on doing that night. I sat down at my desk and I drafted an email to my lawyer. Not a dramatic email, not a threatening one, just an email asking for a meeting at his earliest convenience to review a few documents I'd been sitting on for some time. Specifically, a property holding, a piece of commercial land about 40 minutes north of the city that I'd purchased with a partner 12 years ago. Land that had appreciated considerably. Land that I'd mentioned to Elliot twice in casual conversation as part of what he might eventually inherit. I also asked about revisiting my will. I sent that email at 1:14 in the morning and then I went to bed. The following 2 weeks, Elliot called 3 times. I answered twice. The conversations were short. He said Sienna was sorry for how things had come across. I asked him if those were her words or his. He was quiet for a moment and then said she wanted to apologize. I said I thought that apology belonged to his mother, not to me. He said he understood. He didn't say anything else, and neither did I. The third call I let go to voicemail. He said he wanted to meet for coffee. He said it was important. Judith heard the message. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and didn't say anything. We both understood what I was going to do. I met Elliot at a Tim Hortons out by the highway, which sounds unglamorous, and maybe that was the point. He came in looking tired, wearing a jacket I'd given him 3 birthdays ago. He got a large coffee. I got a medium. We sat across from each other, in a booth with orange plastic seats, and he said, "Dad, I'm sorry about what happened." I said, "What are you sorry for, specifically?" He blinked. Then he said, "Sienna was out of line." I said, "Your mother." He nodded. "She was out of line with Mom." I said, "And you?" He looked down at his coffee, took a breath. Then he said, "I know, I should have said something. I don't know why I didn't." I told him I did know why. I told him that when you spend enough time with someone who controls the atmosphere of every room they're in, you start to lose track of your own instincts. I told him I'd watched it happening for 2 years, and I hadn't said anything, and that was partly on me. I said I wasn't angry at him the way he might think I was angry. I was something more complicated than angry. He asked what that meant. I said it meant that I loved him, that I would always love him. But that love isn't the same as access, and the two of them had made it clear over the past year that Judith and I were welcome in their lives at a level of involvement that was somewhere between obligatory and ornamental. And that after what happened at the wedding, I had done some thinking about what I owed to myself and to his mother. He asked what I was talking about. I told him I had called my lawyer. He went very still. I said I hadn't made any decisions yet. That wasn't a threat, it was the truth. I told him I was still deciding what I thought was fair. I told him that his mother had given him 24 years of nursing shifts and early mornings and every school concert and every hospital visit and every birthday dinner, and she had done all of that without ever once asking for anything back except to be treated with basic human dignity, and that at his own wedding, in front of 160 people, she had been told to go. Elliot didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, "What do I need to do?" I told him the first thing he needed to do had nothing to do with me. He already knew what it was. 3 days later, Sienna and Elliot showed up at our house, together. Sienna came in and stood in our hallway, and I watched her look at Judith, who had come out from the kitchen wearing her reading glasses and a blue cardigan, and looking completely, infuriatingly composed. Sienna said, "I owe you an apology. What I said was cruel and it was wrong and I am sorry." Judith said, "I know. Not, it's okay. Not, don't worry about it. Just, I know." The most dignified 2 words in the English language, delivered in a tone that said everything about who had the power in that moment. We sat in the living room for about an hour. It was not comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. Sienna did most of the talking, explaining things about stress and pressure and family expectations, and I sat quietly and let her. At some point, she looked at me and said she understood if I had concerns about things going forward. I said I appreciated that. After they left, Judith washed the coffee mugs and said, "Do you think she meant it?" I said I thought she meant it enough. We gave them space over the following months. We didn't push for dinners or phone calls, but something had shifted in Elliot. I could hear it in the way he talked, something looser, something more like himself. He called his mother on a Tuesday just to talk, which he hadn't done in almost a year. He came out to help me with a fence repair in October without being asked. Small things. But with people you love, small things are how you measure everything. In November, I had a follow-up call with my lawyer, not about rewriting anything, just reviewing what was on paper and what my options were. I'd looked at that commercial property. I'd been in contact with a developer in Nisku who'd been circling it for 2 years, and the numbers were significant. Significant enough to matter to Elliot's future in a real way. I didn't tell Elliot any of that, not yet. But I made a note to myself that his behavior in the coming months would tell me more than any conversation could. In December, Sienna organized Christmas at their place. She called Judith personally to ask what she'd like her to cook. She asked me by text if there was a wine I preferred. On Christmas Day, she had a photo of Elliot and Judith on the mantle, the 2 of them at Elliot's university graduation, mixed in with the photos from the wedding. I noticed it when I walked in. I didn't say anything about it. But I noticed, the dinner was good. Sienna is a decent cook when she's not performing for anyone. Elliot made a point during dinner to raise a glass and say something about his parents, something real, something with specific details. He mentioned the hockey. He mentioned the way I taught him to pour concrete when he was 16. He mentioned the time Judith drove 4 hours in a February snowstorm to bring him soup when he had mono in his second year of university. Sienna watched him do it, and she didn't look uncomfortable. She looked like she was listening. I caught Judith's eye across the table. She gave me a small smile. The kind she's been giving me for 31 years. The kind I know means, this is going to be okay. After dinner, Elliot and I sat out on their back deck with the space heater going, the way you do in Alberta even in December if you want a moment of quiet. He asked me how the property was doing. I told him I'd had some interest from a developer. He nodded, didn't push. Then he said, I think about that night a lot. I said, which part? He said, all of it. But mostly the part where you walked out without saying anything. I kept waiting for you to lose it, and you didn't. I told him that I almost had. I told him that what Sienna did made me furious in a way I don't have a better word for. But I also told him that I knew, standing there looking at him across that room, that the way I responded in that moment was going to mean more than anything I'd ever said to him. That he was watching me. That the kind of man I was in that 10 seconds was going to tell him more about me than the previous 31 years combined. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I didn't stand up. I said no. He said, I've been thinking about why. I said good. We sat out there until the cold got too much, which in Edmonton in December takes longer than it should because you get used to it. Then we went back inside and Judith was helping Sienna stack dishes, the two of them talking about something I couldn't hear, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and just watched them. I'm not going to tell you everything is fixed. I don't believe in that framing. Families don't get fixed. They adjust. They recalibrate. They learn, sometimes painfully, and over a long time, what everyone can and can't carry. What I can tell you is that the version of my son who sat across from me in that Tim Hortons booth was not the same person who sat in that chair at his own wedding and said nothing. Something had moved in him. I don't know if Sienna fully changed or if she just understood finally what was actually at stake. Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe she just decided that the cost of losing Elliot's parents was higher than the cost of treating them like people. What I know is this. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't send angry texts or write letters or call relatives to take sides. I just got quiet and I got deliberate, and I've waited for my son to figure out who he actually was. He's still figuring it out, but he's heading in the right direction. And Judith? She's been sleeping well. She tends to her garden. She meets her friends for lunch. She video calls her grandnieces on Sundays. Last week, she came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and put her arms around me from behind and just stood there for a minute. I said, "You okay?" She said, "Yeah, I just wanted to." That's enough for me.